Richard Sharp is the chairman of the BBC. The former Goldman Sachs banker was appointed to the role by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson in January of 2021. But it's now emerged that in the run-up to that appointment, Sharp had been advising Johnson about his personal finances and appears to have helped him secure a loan of up to £800,000 to finance his lavish lifestyle. The Sunday Times broke the story, reporting this. Late in 2020, Johnson, 58, was in financial trouble as he faced divorce payments, childcare costs and bills for the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat. Sharp, a friend and former advisor to the politician who has given £400,000 to the Conservative Party, became involved that November after a dinner at the home of Sam Blythe, an old friend in West London. Blythe, 67, a multi-millionaire Canadian businessman and distant cousin of Johnson, is said to have raised the idea of acting as the PM's guarantor and asked Sharp for advice on the best way forward. So we have Boris Johnson's choice for BBC chair being asked by a distant cousin of Boris Johnson how he can help secure Johnson a loan. Very bizarre, cosy world you're getting a description of there. Anyway, what happened next? So after those meetings, in the first week of December 2020, Sharp took Blythe's offer to Simon Case. He's the cabinet secretary and the head of the civil service. At that point, Sharp was already on the shortlist for the top BBC job. In fact, just a few weeks before, ITV's Robert Peston wrote this in The Spectator. So who will be BBC chair? When would-be applicants ring ministerial chums, their stock response is, don't waste your time applying. The PM has made up his mind. It will be Richard Sharp. So it was widely known that Sharp was Johnson's preferred candidate, a fact that Johnson made official in late December. Yet, Simon Case, so this is the top civil servant, seemed to think there were no ethical problems with Sharp helping Boris Johnson secure a loan. A little bit complicated. It's all going to become clear, don't worry. The Sunday Times goes on to report this. According to Whitehall sources, Case agreed to Blythe helping and instigating a due diligence process, but told Sharp his involvement needed to end. In parallel, Johnson went to see Case to tell him Sharp had been helping him and received the same response. So Case saying it's all fine up to now, but please, cut off these relationships now, given he's going to become the BBC chair. That warning from the cabinet secretary didn't stop Sharp, Johnson and the loan guarantor Blythe from meeting up for dinner. This again is from the Sunday Times. Before the loan was finalised, Johnson, Sharp and Blythe had a private dinner at Chequers, the Prime Minister's grace and favour home in the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire, where, according to a source, they ate chop suey and drank wine. The Free insist that Johnson's finances were not discussed. Johnson's loan was finalised in February 2021, the same month that Richard Sharp started in his new role as chair of the BBC. But Johnson never declared Sharp's involvement in sorting out his finances. It doesn't appear in either the MP's Register of Interests or in Johnson's Register of Ministerial Interests. And Richard Sharp never mentioned it either. Johnson, of course, denies any wrongdoing.
This is a load of complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. Let me just tell you, Richard Sharp is a good and a wise man, but he knows absolutely nothing about my personal finances. I can tell you that for 100% ding-dang sure. This is just another example of the BBC disappearing up its own fundament, and that, I propose, is
so it's just a coincidence that this appointment was arranged at the same time as your loan?
That was Johnson very proudly wearing his hat, I presume he'd just got from Ukraine. He obviously goes to Kiev anytime there is any political problems at home for him. And while Richard Sharp also denies that there's anything to see here, he's asked the BBC to investigate whether there have been any conflicts of interest since he joined as chair in 2021. Meanwhile, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, whose job it is to ensure that public appointments are above board, has launched his own investigation. The Commissioner has written to Lucy Powell MP to confirm he will be reviewing the competition for the BBC chair appointment to ensure it was conducted in line with the Governance Code for Public Appointments. So Lucy Powell, a Labour MP, so they've asked the Commissioner to investigate and they have obliged. When Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was asked about Sharp's appointment, he understandably seemed pretty keen to distance himself from it.
Will you order some sort of probe into the appointment of Richard Sharp as BBC chairman and his relationship to the former Prime Minister?
Well, this appointment was obviously made by one of my predecessors before I became Prime Minister, And the appointments process itself, though, for appointing the BBC chairman is a rigorous process. It's independent. There are two stages to it. It's transparent and published online. And Mr. Sharp's appointment went through that full process.
So as I say, it's a slightly complicated story, but it does seem pretty outrageous. So you've got three characters. Boris Johnson, you all know who Boris Johnson is. He gets to choose who the chair of the BBC will be. As I say, the chair of the BBC, responsible for impartiality. So it seems like it should be a pretty, politically contentious role. Anyway, Boris Johnson chooses his old friend to be the chair of the BBC. And it just so happens that his old friend helped get a guarantor for him to get a loan of £800,000. Bizarrely, the person who became the guarantor was a distant cousin. I think you have to be at a certain sort of place in the class structure of this country to know distant cousins. I've got no idea who a distant cousin of my own would be, which is unfortunate. I wouldn't mind a guarantor for a few loans. But anyway, this guy, intermediary between Boris Johnson and his distant cousin to get him a loan, then he gets made BBC chair.
You were saying that you wouldn't really know a distant cousin or be able to pick him out of a lineup. The aristocracy moves in very different ways, Michael. Unlike us plebs who have a handful of cousins who annoy you at Christmas time, the entire aristocracy is known as the cousinhood. So there are complex webs of marriages and blood ties. Sometimes these two things overlap. And that is one of the things which, literally, socially and economically preserves wealth, power within the hands of the elite. You have a particular kind of class solidarity amongst the establishment. And it's, quite often a family business, shall we say. I think the main way in which this is damaging for Boris Johnson isn't the naked and flagrant corruption, which I believe is par for the course. Nobody thinks of Boris Johnson and goes, you know what, there is a squeaky clean politician. I think that the existence of compromat on the former prime minister must be the worst kept secret in the intelligence services. Absolutely everyone knows that somebody's got something. So nobody thinks of him as squeaky clean, and I don't think this is going to be, wholly surprising that he would abuse what should be a selection process, a candidate selection process, which has the public good at heart for his own individual ends. That is totally in keeping with what we know about him. The thing for me, which is interesting, is that you've got a prime minister with an £800,000 hole in his finances, which is being plugged by, a businessman on one hand and, the process is lubricated by somebody who wants, a very powerful, cushy job on the other, is then it tells you, okay, well, how independent is this prime minister? Who is he answering to and why? And when those things are opaque, when they involve the personal financial interests of a prime minister, a former prime minister, that really is a fatal structural weakness at the heart of our politics. The Profumo scandal in the 1960s, which I believe was, when you were a lad of 9 or 10, Michael, was, because you had the Minister of War, sleeping with the same woman as a Soviet attaché. The idea was, well, hang on, what is it that someone has over you? It's a matter of national security. But along comes Boris Johnson, with his grubby little fingers in absolutely every pie, going to, Lebedev's party. No one knows who his other guest was. He was looking, disheveled and rather worse for wear the next day. Loans from cronies coming out of his ears, and nobody goes, or nobody went rather, at the critical time when he was, in the running to be prime minister. Does this mean that you are fundamentally unsuitable to take this role? Does this endanger our politics, our democracy, national security in some fundamental way? There was an extraordinary casualness about it. The fact that this is in the public sphere now, maybe it makes it a bit harder if he does want a return to front bench politics or indeed the top job. But I think it's the BBC that comes off worse in all of this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, let's move on to the BBC because, I mean, the allegation here is pretty serious for Boris Johnson, of course. It seems as if potentially he gave a very top job to someone after they helped him financially, or at least helped sort out his financial situation. It doesn't look good for the BBC, though, either, and especially for their impartiality, if the guy in charge was so close to the then Prime Minister. Apparently, this is nothing new, though, as the Sunday Times explain. The BBC has a long tradition of politically connected individuals acting in senior roles. Gavin Davies, another former Goldman Sachs banker, chaired the corporation between 2001 and 2004. He faced accusations of cronyism from opposition parties as he was married to Sunai, advisor to Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, and had previously been a Labour Party member. Greg Dyke, Director General, at about the same period, had donated £50,000 to Labour. Under David Cameron, chairman of the board included Lord Patten, who was Conservative Party chairman under John Major, and before that a minister in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, and Rona Fairhead, who became a Conservative life peer and minister shortly after stepping down from the role. Tim Davie, the incumbent Director General, was a Conservative council candidate. However, there is no known precedent of a Prime Minister selecting an individual who was simultaneously helping them with their personal finances. This does not seem healthy to me. You've got all of these very well-connected people, party donors. You donate 50 grand to a political party, and then that political party make you Director General of the BBC. Look, we talk about donations getting you a peerage, but at least you're only one of 800 people when you go into the House of Lords. This makes, you become one of the most important people in the country, or probably the most important person in British media if you end up with a Director General job and you get this after donations. Very worrying. The last paragraph, though, is especially damning. This is the first time that it seems as if financial interests have been involved, or at least personal financial interests. And you might think the BBC would want to prove their objectivity by robustly covering this story. But on that front, they didn't make a great start. After the Sunday Times broke the story, the BBC invited this guest on to their main politics show to discuss it.
All the parties involved have given statements to the Sunday Times, which suggest they did everything above board and everything was transparent. I suggest you ask Sir Simon Case, who seems to be the linchpin in both these stories, to come on and say what happened and make him do a tick. The cabinet secretary, who obviously was the cabinet secretary during Nadeem Zahawi's time, also was the one that Richard Sharp properly said should be involved if any such introduction was made between him and
I'm probably on a hiding to nothing, but I'll say also for transparency, we'd be delighted to have Simon Case or indeed Boris Johnson in the studio any Sunday morning they fancy coming on, or even during the week. We'd be happy to go and film an interview with him.
Yes, you got that right. That was Boris Johnson's sister, Rachel Johnson. She was on the panel with a former Conservative leader and the director of Tesco. So that was the politically balanced panel, which was on the Laura Kuenssberg Sunday show. And you saw there Rachel Johnson, that objective voice of reason, no skin in the game, saying that the problem was all Simon Case, not her brother.
You know what? Absolute power to Laura Kuenssberg for managing to put together the only panel which could possibly defend the BBC's actions in a case that absolutely stinks to high heaven of corruption and a direct conflict of interest, eh? I mean, producers work hard, so, whoever's doing her show deserves a pay rise. I mean, look, do you remember when on the first episode, they got the comedian Joe Lycett on and everybody shat themselves? And they said, oh, this makes a complete mockery of the, sacred tradition of pundits talking about the news. These shows serve a really important purpose when it comes to holding the powerful to account and informing the public. Do you remember when everybody was saying that? And it's great that Laura Kuenssberg took all those criticisms on board and went, nothing serves the public good more than getting a disgraced politician's sister on the show to come and defend them as though that's a perfectly normal thing to do. I mean, look, the reason why I'm taking the piss is because that whole segment takes the piss out of its viewers, its audience, and the country at large. It is so nakedly and obviously biased that you're almost shocked and stunned into silence. What can you say about it other than when it comes to this very cozy establishment club where nobody really is to the right of Tony Blair? They're all friends, they all socialize, they all consider themselves as being, part of the same political and social class, and everybody else is on the outside of it. When you see the horrendous cronyism of it at play, and when you see what it does to our public institutions, whether that's politics or the BBC, you can't help but think that yes, Joe Lycett was a comedian. He was on this panel, but he wasn't making clowns out of all of us, which is exactly what Laura Kuenssberg and Rachel Johnson are doing.